everyone, welcome to the OxAI podcast. I'm your host Jessie from the Oxford Artificial Intelligence Society. Today we're extremely thrilled to welcome Nestor Maslej to join the show. Nestor is the research manager at the Stanford Institute of Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, where he leads the production of the influential AI Index report. His work sits at the intersection of policy, data, and global AI trends, helping government, industry leaders, and public better understand how artificial intelligence is shaping our world. He is known for translating the complex technical developments into clear, actionable insights, making him a key voice in the conversation about responsible and transparent AI progress. Thanks for joining us today, Nestor.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be here.
Let's get started then. So you just published the influential 2025 AI Index. Do you mind sharing some most surprising and significant trends that you observed this year?
I mean, there's a lot to talk about in the report. It's close to 500 pages long. And I mean, I'm someone who it's my job to kind of follow trends in AI. So for me, there isn't that much that is surprising. But I think one of the stories that really I kind of saw this year was AI systems becoming a lot more kind of efficient, affordable, and accessible. I think when we published the AI index last year, one of the big narratives was that it costs a lot of money to train these systems. Training costs are going through the roof. Industry, as a result, is really dominating in the production of these systems. And I think there's open questions as to whether that trend was going to continue moving forward. And I mean, it has to a certain degree, like models on the frontier are getting more expensive. But also another trend you're seeing is that there are a class of models now that are getting smaller and smaller, but still performing at a fairly robust level of intelligence. I think one of the things that we report is that, for example, the cost of querying a model that has the intelligence level of GPT 3.5 has dropped from roughly $20 per million tokens in November of 2022 all the way to 7 cents per million tokens in November of 2024. You know, closed models are no longer substantially better than open models. That gap is closed. And you have increasing improvements in hardware that has made it a lot more affordable and efficient to train these systems. And I think that's something that's exciting because it could really mean that AI as a technology could become a lot more ubiquitous and much more usable.
This is amazing to know, especially with advancing so much in terms of like software, hardware, and it's much cheaper, much more scalable as well over time. So like you mentioned something about industry's contribution. We also saw there has been like some sharp rise in industry contribution compared to academia. So how can we interpret this shift and what implication does this have?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of data in the index that shows that, again, over time in the last decade, a lot of these systems have been coming out of industrial labs, more so than academic ones. And I think part of that is tied to the fact that really now to build a lot of these AI systems, you need compute, you need smart people, and you need money to actually pay for a lot of the computational resources in addition to data. And industry, possesses those a lot more than academia at the moment. They have the capital, they have access to data, and an increasingly large number of AI PhDs are heading to industry. And I think that this isn't something the index kind of laments per se, but I think the position that we would have as kind of an institute is that it's important that academics are also kind of empowered to do really good research work. If you look at historically where a lot of leading technological innovations have come out of, both in the space of AI and more broadly, they've come out of university settings where actors in academia were kind of empowered to research for the sake of researching. And when you kind of take that atmosphere away, you maybe kind of risk potentially limiting the amount of high quality research and innovation that can occur. So I think that's a trend that we're still starting to see kind of happening in the present moment. But again, this kind of trend of there being better open source models, better models that are kind of cheaper to build, that perhaps has some potential to kind of level the playing field. I mean, I don't think we're ever going to get to a moment where a university is going to be releasing an AI system that is going to go toe-to-toe with whatever's on the frontier. But now it's probably no longer as expensive to build a somewhat capable foundation model as it was, let's say, 3-4 years ago.
So you mentioned it's getting cheaper, the model is getting cheaper and smaller. So do you think this can support academic development going forward?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that if there's access to kind of high quality open models, these are things that academics can use and build on. I think that if it is relatively inexpensive to train a foundation model that, is performing at a somewhat capable level, that might kind of incentivize universities to do that. It might also incentivize governments in different countries to do that. There's, of course, been a lot of discussion around sovereign AI that you've seen recently. I think that the landscape there kind of is starting to change. I mean, I think the signs really still show that industry is ahead in a lot of different ways. I mean, academics still do well, publishing a lot of significant papers, but I do think that the tide could be turning a little bit, and that's something that's really encouraging to see.
That will be exciting to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
I saw in one of the chapter you mentioned, most influential citation comes from academia.
Yes, it does. I mean, we did an analysis where we looked at the top 100 most cited AI papers in 2021, 2022, and 2023. And I believe in every single one of those years, most of these papers came out of the academy. And increasingly, there's less and less papers coming from industry. And I think that has less to do with industry, let's say, doing less research, but more probably about industry publishing that research less openly, right? Like if you look at GPT-3 versus GPT-4 in the papers, GPT-4 said a lot less about how they actually built the model. And they say very explicitly in that paper that part of the reason they're doing that is because the landscape has become more competitive. So you do wonder what effect the kind of mounting AI competition is going to have on how a lot of these companies produce and do things.
We'll see more technical report compared to research papers.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you think like open source would be more helpful going forward, or like at least from the policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of not, I don't think it's kind of the position of the index to say like what approach is better or not. I mean, there's pretty kind of hot debates in the AI community about the merits of closed weight models versus open weight models. But I do think that there are certain things that open weight models allow you to do. You can access a model transparently, makes it a little bit more accessible. You know, if you're an academic or a nonprofit actor that wants to kind of more freely experiment and build with these systems, a bit easier to do that with open weight models. So I think there's advantages that these models kind of bring. And, you know, if we're kind of in the interest of really, let's say, creating technology that could be widely used, I think open weights kind of come with a lot of advantages there. But again, I think the index is more, it's kind of our job to just see what the data is telling us. And I think I'll kind of leave it to the policymakers and other people to decide which modeling approach is better.
Yeah, of course, that makes sense. In terms of policymakers, that's actually a question from us. So, because we know you brief policymaker around the world about what kind of about like idea about development. Out of curiosity, what question do they typically ask, and where do you think is the biggest gap in their understanding?
That's a good point. I think it really depends who you speak to. I think that because AI is such a general purpose technology, it touches on a lot of different verticals. So policymakers tend to have very wide ranging concerns. And I think this is reflective if you look at the data on like AI regulations in the United States that come from regulations and agencies on the level of the FDA, for example, it's coming from a diversity of agencies. So there's a diversity of concerns. I think that if I were to maybe kind of pinpoint a top concern that I see, I think a lot of it concerns kind of jobs. And if you look at a lot of data, a lot of countries in the Western world are very pessimistic about AI relative to some other countries like China, Thailand, Indonesia. I personally think that has something to do with the fact that people see AI as a tool that might change the way in which they do work. And there's a lot of anxiety that surrounds that.
That's interesting to know, because we saw in this index include more public perception data. Like over last year, we saw like there has been some increase in some countries and decline in some other country.
Yeah.
What do you think is resulting in this kind of phenomenon?
Yeah, so we don't have good, let's say, empirical evidence to explain why things are shifting. I mean, first I'll kind of comment on the trend. So I think there's two things. So one is that global optimism on AI seems to be rising. So if you look at Ipsos, which probably I think has the most reliable overtime data on this point, the amount of people that say that they feel that products and services using AI have more benefits than drawbacks has gone up in most of the countries that have been surveyed from 2022 to 2024. And some of the countries that have seen the biggest increases have been, again, those countries like Canada, France, Great Britain, where there was pretty substantial pessimism before. Now, a lot of those countries are still substantially less optimistic than, again, the Chinas, the Thailands, and the Indonesias. I think my take is that if you look at data as to what people in these countries that are pessimistic actually are afraid of when it comes to AI, the top most cited concern is kind of job loss. And I think we've kind of had this phenomenon where ChatGPT has come out, and I think people can kind of see what it could do, but a lot of people are still kind of working jobs and perhaps see that this is a tool that is kind of aiding what they can do and not necessarily something that might replace them. That's kind of my take or my kind of perception, and seeing some of the ways in which it could be helpful as well. I think why some other countries in the world are more optimistic, one of the faculty co-leads of Stanford High, James Lande, makes a good point that, in certain countries like Canada, the United States, and the UK, where there's a high standard of living, if you tell someone, for example, that using an AI medical system that has a 90% accuracy rate is what we're going to be using in a hospital setting, people might kind of flip out and say that's not good enough. But in other countries like India, where maybe you just don't have access to any doctor, period, 90% is better than nothing. So maybe some of these countries see AI as a tool that could potentially level the playing field and kind of close that gap a little bit.
That's great to know. So it kind of summarizes there are like two main concerns. So first, in terms of like job market, and second is more like how AI can support increased living standard or like everyday life.
Yeah, so this isn't something that we kind of see in the data. The job stuff we do see in the data, that's from Pew a few years ago. This is just kind of more my speculation on why I think these things kind of differ. These are my own opinions, but it kind of speaks to the fact that as much information as we kind of talk about in the index, there's always more questions that we're really interested in exploring.
We saw like the AI index includes new metrics on AI safety and ethics. So when you are choosing these indicators, which factor do you look into, and what story does the number tell?
Yeah, so the Responsible AI chapter this year was authored by Anka Royal, so shout out to her. She's a very good PhD student at Stanford, I think one of the leading RAI researchers in the world, and she basically kind of looked through the literature for kind of metrics that she thought were kind of particularly salient and relevant. She does a lot of work on benchmarking AI systems and kind of figuring out what good benchmarks actually are. I think one of the big narratives that we saw this year with RAI on this point is that there is still a lack of standardization in industry when it comes to industrial actors testing their models or a certain subset of benchmarks. However, it does seem like academics have stepped up. So there have been new benchmarks introduced like Helm Safety or AirBench, which is kind of an attempt by the academic community to offer some kind of standardized evaluation suite for the RAI or safety features of different models. So I think that kind of landscape is shifting a little bit there. But of course, we're looking for benchmarks that seem to be kind of accurate, that are well designed, that are widely adopted by the community. And I think RAI is a bit of a different landscape than general capabilities. With general capabilities, there seems to be a good consensus about which benchmarks are used and which benchmarks people report on. With RAI, you don't see that consensus as much.
With the rise of agentic AI systems, we saw there has been some upcoming benchmark on agency security or the agency's efficiency. What would be a good benchmark for agencies? And how does this benchmark differ from traditional LLMs?
Well, I think that, there are benchmarks for agentic AI. I think we pointed out a few in the index, like Rebench is a new one that looks at the agentic capabilities of models and coding settings. There's other ones like ML Agent Bench. I think that it does seem to be challenging, though, in that there doesn't seem to be an agentic benchmark that has kind of caught the attention of the community in the way that ImageNet captured computer vision's attention in the 2010s, and that, let's say now, MMLU. That probably is saturated at this point, but it has been kind of one of the go-to language modeling benchmarks. And I think part of that is just agentic tasks are much more kind of flexible and open-ended, like by virtue of getting models to do agentic things. Success in that is kind of defined by your ability to flexibly operate in diverse environments. So creating like a constrained benchmark that has a very particular task might not necessarily be the way to capture that. And it kind of speaks to the fact that like some of the tasks in which AI systems are perhaps lagging behind in humans, like a lot of kinetic motion tasks, robotics tasks, agentic tasks, those are things that are more difficult to kind of construct benchmarks for. So perhaps we need to be kind of rethinking how we even evaluate systems in the future.
That's good to know, because it sounds like definitely far more dynamic. As you mentioned, agency sounds like there's a lot of planning there, and the emotion, probably psychological AI development. So maybe we're gonna get many new benchmarks coming up.
Yeah, there's always new research on different benchmarks that are being introduced, but I think it's also important to kind of think of how the AI landscape has changed and how that should change the way in which we think about benchmarks, because I think 10 years ago, benchmarks existed so that academics could really learn and discover what's actually going on with AI, how well these systems can think and reason. And now we're in a world in which these systems are used in business. There is a lot of risks that are associated with using these systems. And I think there's open-ended questions that are asked about, okay, how well are these systems actually going to perform in a lot of these settings? And benchmarking a model to figure out how smart it is different than benchmarking it to figure out how well it could do a business task.
That's great. Yeah, that's a very good point. So do you think going forward we might move away from benchmarking to sort of like kind of new system, like assessing model performance?
I think benchmarking is still going to be around. I think there's a lot more kind of discussion now about how do we design good benchmarks, but now it's kind of, again, a moment in the ecosystem where we're trying to figure out like what system is kind of more usable. And I think that's a business question in a lot of ways. And I think businesses sometimes have good intuitions about which systems are kind of better usable for them. And, they might rely on benchmarks to do that. They might kind of have their own tests and their own kind of mechanisms of actually kind of determining performance. In some ways also, I think the benchmarking thing has always been a desire to kind of understand how smart these systems are relative to us. Like, can they mirror our cognitive capabilities? But I think, to me, of course, the tech is going to get better, but in some ways, I think the story of AI moving forward in the next half decade is going to be less about technical improvement and more about how do you design usable interfaces for people to use the technology, because the technology is already incredibly strong. Like, you could do a lot with it, but depending on the kind of architecture that exists around how you use it, that could really determine the extent to which it gets broadly embraced in society.
That's great to know. As you mentioned, now we see all this model that allows reasoning, like ChatGPT 4.0. So would you see the new trend for the industry going forward to create better product, kind of productionize this like language model?
Yeah, I think it's about figuring out ways to get people to actually, like, AI, I think, is not a product. It's like a source of energy. And, much like we have electricity, you could use it to power lights, to power a computer, to charge microphones. But the usage you're going to have for it is going to depend on the wiring that you create for it. And I mean, a good example of this application is there's this new startup now, Cursor, which is kind of designed to help software engineers kind of do a lot of coding. And I recently heard that they have kind of fundraised at a rather obscene valuation. And I was asking a computer scientist, I mean, I'm not a computer scientist. I was like, why don't you just use like a chatbot, like, ChatGPT or kind of Claude to do the coding for you? Why do you need to use Cursor? And the computer scientist was explaining to me that Cursor is just kind of built in a good way to kind of make it easier to code. And apparently, I think a very high proportion of, let's say, Anthropic's API usage is directly derived from Cursor. So Cursor, I think, is a very good example of how a startup has like built some kind of application layer that is allowing us to kind of leverage the technology in a way that is driving a lot of productivity.
So it sounds like there's a lot of space to explore in terms of how to use this technology for application.
Oh, 100%, yeah.
I definitely personally keep to try it out. And sorry, like shifting the conversation a little bit, that was definitely a fascinating discussion point. So like the last question is, the index tracks global AI development. Do you think we're actually headed towards a multiplayer AI world, or is it still a US-China race dressed up in nice charts?
It's a good question. I mean, I still think US-China is going to be the kind of dominant two players. We have a tool called the Global Vibrancy Tool, which is kind of tracking how well these different models are kind of doing and how well different countries are doing in the space. I do think there are less and less barriers for entry for other countries. Like, I remember when I was kind of on tour for the index last year, speaking to different policymakers, you would have policymakers in some sovereign countries ask, like, should we build our own LLMs? And I was like, well, I don't know how realistic that is given how expensive it is to build frontier models. But, it may have cost you, and I don't actually know the numbers, but I'm curious to kind of figure this out. Like, I could imagine that a model that may have cost like 10 million to train a few years ago probably is going to cost a fraction of that now, partially because, again, we have better hardware, more efficient algorithms, and that kind of changes the game where, maybe some of these countries that aren't going to be US and China aren't going to have the cutting edge models, but they'll still have pretty damn good ones. And it's a bit more easy to kind of do that now, again, because the ecosystem has become a lot more accessible, as I've spoken to.
So now with the smaller and more efficient training, we can see more players coming up.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's amazing to know. Well, since we still have a little bit of time, just a fun last question. If you were to add a new chapter to next year's index, what would that be?
It's a good question. I think for us, we have a pretty good topic coverage, as in, I don't know if there's many more kind of topic categories that we aren't covering from a holistic sense. I think it's more about within each chapter, what are particular avenues of inquiry that we explore? And I think there's a lot of them that kind of come to mind. I think one thing that I would like to see, and I'll kind of maybe list three here. One thing that I would like to see is perhaps for us to kind of move towards running our own kind of benchmark evaluations on some of these models. One of the things that we kind of note with benchmarks, and this was the first year in the report where we weren't necessarily critical of benchmarks, but we, I think, openly acknowledged some of their limitations. I mean, a lot of benchmarks suffer from contamination. There's also a lot of instances where developers report scores on benchmarks that aren't verified by third parties. In the RAI, there's a lot of different benchmarks that are being tested by different developers. So it'd be cool to kind of do that development in-house and kind of standardize the playing field. I think for the economy, it would be really interesting to kind of do some, let's say, cross-sectoral, cross-industrial study that is longitudinal, that looks at how AI is being used in business and what kind of ROI it is crucially driving. Because a lot of the research that we have there now is, I'd say, rather micro level. It's like individual academic studies that look at a very narrow context, or it is perhaps McKinsey data that is asking for people's opinions, or it is maybe data from like Ramp. I know that startup has data on which AI system people are using, but I think there is need for more comprehensive data that can ask some of these questions about how do we actually figure out in a very concrete way what impact AI is having on the economy. And on the policy side, I mean, we started doing some analysis on how much governments are spending on AI. I think we would love to get more of that data for other countries in the world, like China, like South Korea, countries that we don't necessarily have as much coverage for.
Definitely excited to see the new chapters coming up.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking forward to it. I think that for us with the index, I think we've gotten better every year. The report becomes more thorough, more comprehensive, but there is always more that you could potentially track. And I think there's a lot of good, let's say, data in the ecosystem now. And in some ways, I think the big question for us moving forward is what is some of this kind of marginal data on the edge that we want to try to kind of collect and understand?
So hopefully as a student, we can contribute a little.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good students, PhDs that are doing research that we feature in the index. So I think if we find things that are relevant and interesting that students do, we definitely we have no problem throwing it into the report.
That's amazing to know. Is there any way of contributing?
Yeah, I would say if students are interested in contributing, just send me an email. I'm happy to kind of see what ideas people have. We always kind of open that dialogue and we kind of take it from there. If there's interesting research projects to do, then we decide to go for them.
It's amazing to know you're open to like all sorts of collaboration as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's very important to kind of involve the community with this.
Really appreciate this. All right, I guess this brings us to the end of our podcast. Thank you so much for the insights today, Nestor. And to the listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please share, subscribe, and stay curious. Until next time.